Michel Rene Barnes' book on The Power of God is an important work in recent scholarship on the Church Fathers, focusing on the use of the term dunamis in the context of Trinitarian theology of the time of the Council of Nyssa. Before we get into Barnes' contribution to this topic, however, I want to make a broader point which will help to drive home the significance of this work. The idea of an essence-energy distinction is often presented by popular apologetics and theology in both Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy as if either of those terms were easily translatable into a given metaphysical system. For Roman Catholics especially, the doctrine of essence and energies has been somewhat dehistoricized and abstracted in order to interrogate its applicability and integrity within a broadly Thomistic system of thought. In particular, although without wanting to single him out for criticism, the scholar Mark C. Spencer has taken this ahistorical approach in order to try and line up Thomistic thought with that of Scotus and Palamas, and thereby to find some common ground, if not a synthesis that might enable some kind of consensus on the issue of essence and energies. While I have no objection to attempts to find agreement and reach a mutual understanding between different traditions, I think there is a fundamental assumption here which rests on a fallacy. Namely, that there is a common deep structure to these traditions by which terms like actuality, potency, dunamis and energeia are more or less convertible, or, if not commensurate, then closely parallel. All that is required, presumably, is the extension or trimming down of certain significations by these terms in order to take stock of their common usage. Frankly, there is something modernistic about this approach, as if we can find an agreed-upon metaphysics which is both flexible enough to allow for agreement between traditions, but rigid and rigorous enough to exclude any overtones of perennialism. Indeed, the assumptions here about language and the meaning of key terms, especially, are quite naive, and I would redirect listeners to a very enlightening discussion on Jay Dyer's channel with Posh Redneck, which touches on the deeper paradigmatic questions which are at stake here. To summarize my point, the issue here is that philosophical terms, like words in a language, do not exist independently of a paradigm. There is no superstructure by which we can exhaust the total set of possibilities for metaphysics. That, indeed, is precisely the issue raised by set theory with regards to mathematical and logical propositions. The assumption that such a loaded term as God, for instance, can find a common referent between traditions, merely because the word has some common usages, is fallacious, because there are so many essential propositions relating to that concept in one tradition, which will be negated in another tradition. These terms, in other words, do not exist independently of a web of relations and an entire metaphysic which gives them their meaning. For example, let us say I have a brother named Michael. A person who lives in the USA also has a brother named Michael. We could in theory write out sets of propositions about ourselves and our family members, and find that some of these abstract propositions share a great deal of content. Yet it is precisely the differences that distinguish my brother from the Michael in America, even if they are both great at basketball and have green as their favourite colour, for instance. How we determine that there are two different people is arguably of greater importance than establishing the common ground, at least depending on our motivations. A linguistic example Posh Redneck gives is the comparison between British English first floor and American English first floor. If we were to translate the British English into American English, we'd find that the former actually corresponds to the second floor for Americans. It's a very basic example, but it does serve to illustrate how practical the notion of paradigms is. Ultimately, this line of thinking with regards to theology comes back to the notion of natural theology, and an important paper by Dr Gyorgy Gereby illustrates the flawed premises within this project. Thus, the kind of attempt as we find in Spencer to bring different systems in line with one another cannot ultimately succeed except by privileging one worldview or paradigm and trying to adapt the others to make them fit. There is, of course, nothing stopping one from coming up with some kind of essence-energies distinction within a broadly Thomistic framework, but that would be to treat the distinction, whatever can be said of it in isolation, as some kind of logical solution to an abstract metaphysical problem, at which point it begs the question as to how much this alleged solution shares in common with the tradition a saint like St. Gregory Palamas sought to defend in his writings. In order truly to understand what we know as the essence-energies distinction requires much more than accepting certain propositions, although our investigations will certainly lead towards that. It requires more broadly, however, that we recover something of the mindset or phronema of those from whom we have received this tradition. And to truly understand St. Gregory Palamas, we have to understand the tradition in which he developed. If he sought to represent orthodoxy and to remain in line with the early church fathers, we must therefore look to the theologians who came before him in order to understand just what was at stake in the claims to continuity. For that reason, I want to focus on the Cappadocian Fathers and their theology, especially St. Gregory of Nyssa and his use of the terms dunamis and energia. And not being a scholar, I am relying on Michel Rene Barnes' work to shed some light on the historical context of St. Gregory of Nyssa's arguments. This historical context will prove very important in linking this inquiry back round into the question of how concepts and terms fit within a certain paradigm, and how we do injury to the concepts if we treat words univocally. One of the most important points Barnes raises early on in his book relates precisely to our theme. He explains that while St. Gregory of Nyssa makes prominent use of the terms dunamis and energeia, he is not applying them according to an Aristotelian metaphysics of act and potency, but in accord with a very different and distinct tradition. As he writes, the beginnings of what I call the technical sense of power lie in the literature of the medical authors who lived a generation or two before Plato. Among the medical authors belonging predominantly to the Hippocratic school, power means the effective capacity or capacities of any given existent distinctive to the identity of that existent. This sense of power is developed in the Hippocratic literature through associating power with the concept of nature, physis. Power is the effective capacity of the nature, or nature as effective capacity. Already the reader can sense the kind of unity presupposed in the Hippocratic play between power and nature, and already the reader can imagine the kind of play power and nature might have in Christian discussions of God's existence, God's nature, God's power. The presence of power causality in discussions of the divine is a general feature of classical theologies. It is this medical tradition upon which St. Gregory is drawing in his use of the term dunamis. Thus it would be a mistake to read them in an Aristotelian sense. Indeed, the automatic association of dunamis with Aristotle is due, then, to an ahistorical reading of Aristotle, and a misunderstanding of how Aristotle was read. In the eras of Middle and Neoplatonism, the potentiality-actuality distinction is a distinctly minor application of these terms. This immediately rules out a strictly Thomistic reading of these terms, and this fact alone will be pivotal in our understanding of St. Gregory's theology. There is no subordination of power to activity for St. Gregory, quite the opposite in fact. Activity, as Barnes translates energeia, is subsequent to dunamis, or power, in what is effectively a chain of causality with respect to God. This causal chain terminates in the term ergon, roughly translated as work, and signifies the effect of an activity. In the context of creation, for instance, we have the divine capacity to create, the dunamis, the activity of creating, the energeia, and the work or effect of creation, ergon, the created order itself. Gregory uses the title divine power, thea dunamis, as his preferred title for God because dunamis is as far back in the descriptive sequence, erga, energeia, dunamis, ousia, as he can meaningfully speak. It is important to remember that in this causal sequence, the further back in the sequence one goes, the greater the correspondence between the causality and the nature. For example, the knowledge of some living thing provided by its products or effects is not as great as the knowledge provided by its activities, which is still less than the knowledge of the nature obtained through knowledge of the powers. The knowledge of human nature gained in archaeology begins with artifacts, but more is learned of human nature through a knowledge of the activities that produced and required these artifacts. Even more would be learned through knowledge of the faculties that felt these requirements and developed the means of production. Why should St. Gregory draw such a seemingly convoluted series of distinctions? Barnes places these distinctions within a polemical context, and I think we can concede something to St. Gregory's opponents, whose objections and questions in a certain way necessitated this level of nuance. Chief among these opponents was perhaps Eunomius of Cyzicus, who takes up a considerable portion of Barnes' book. As he writes, Eunomius argues that the activity had a beginning for reasons that are central to his understanding of energeia as a causal term. He argues that if the divine activity existed, it would produce works. That is, whenever activity exists, it produces works insofar as it exists. The works would then be eternal as well. Christians do not believe this and cannot, but the pagans do and make the cosmos co-eternal with God. Eunomius's assumption here has gone unnoticed in scholarly literature. The work exists contemporaneously with the activity, because the activity is understood to exist only as productive. An activity cannot be unproductive at any time that it exists. If it does not produce, it does not exist. Eunomius raises a good point here, I think, which St. Gregory does not directly deny. That is, that there is a certain sense in which an activity and its effect are contemporaneous. This is because Eunomius sees energeia as proceeding by the divine will, and it follows that what God wills necessarily comes to be without obstruction. Where Eunomius errs, however, is in conflating power and activity, and this seems to be crucial in understanding St. Gregory's theology. For it seems to me that to have power precede activity, causally, St. Gregory allows for the contingency of a certain activity in accordance with God's will, namely the activity of creating ad extra. Hence, rather than denying Eunomius's claim that activity and effect are contemporaneous, St. Gregory objects to the conflation of the faculty with the activity of that faculty, as if to have a capacity to run meant that one runs necessarily. This objection is more widely levelled at Eunomius, because for him the Son is precisely identified with the power of God as something separate and subordinate to the nature, which Eunomius identifies univocally with the Father. As Barnes writes, the Cappadocian's argument that the demiurgic power of the Son reveals his natural unity with God the Father turns upon the understanding that any creative power must be united to the essence. Indeed, Eunomius's understanding of power as a separate hypostasis to the Father recalls to St. Gregory the theology of Philo of Alexandria. This, to the Cappadocians, is absurd, for as Barnes puts it, if the power to create is in fact a power, then it is connatural to God, and, as part of his nature, creating can no more be delegated than an eye can delegate seeing or fire delegate burning. While Eunomius strove to dichotomize nature and activity, St. Gregory elevates power and distinguishes it from activity. Power is transcendent, for as we have seen, it precedes any activity, and thus corresponds more closely to nature. For St. Gregory, since both are proper to nature, however, the real dichotomy, so to speak, is that between the created and the uncreated, a point he lays out in his book Against Eunomius. This important category of God's power is one that was in later history somewhat sidelined by the Aristotelian language of act and potency, as Barnes began his book by noting. In future videos I hope to examine whether this historical development may explain some of the modern-day controversy around St. Gregory Palamas and his use of these terms. With him in mind, we should be wary of conflating terms and concepts, as if the former are always univocal, or else we run the risk of estranging St. Gregory Palamas from the Cappadocian Fathers, and regarding him as some kind of anomaly within Christian theology. Rather, given his reception in the East, St. Gregory Palamas ought to be recognized as a champion for and elucidator of tradition, who faced the particular challenges of his own time. In the next video, however, I will look at how this tradition is received by St. Maximus the Confessor, who remains a beacon of orthodoxy and of continuity with the Cappadocians in his theology.